It's a great pleasure to have a good friend of Darden, Scott Price, with us, an alumni of the school, and also the Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer for UPS, the Global Delivery and Services Company. So my first question to you, Scott, what does the transformation mean in your title? And second, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Darden. Should I add transformation to my title? I've asked the Dean about that.
It's a common buzzword these days. I run into them quite a bit. So I'm actually a very different sort of UPSer, as we call ourselves. So a 112-year company, it has been 100% promote from within for that entire time. Our chairman and CEO, who himself has been at the company 45 years, he started as a driver, realized that the mega trends that were coming at the company were speeding so quickly that the lack of diversity of experience within the organization was such that he wanted to go outside for what he called as a transformation role, which was a bit nebulous. And so I have a background in my career with FMCG, all other logistics as well, retail. And so in getting to talk to him, in essence what transformation does is it takes cost savings through various programs to invest differently to change the trajectory of the growth of the company. So I have corporate strategy on the one side. I have a transformation office, very unpopular people. They chase around other people with scorecards. So that's not a lot of fun. Our global back offices, so we have 80 facilities around the world, about 15,000 people who do all processing of work, again, bending the cost curve. But probably the funnest part of my job is our M&A and strategic investment fund, where we do seed, series A and B. And then the advanced technology group reports to me, which is all of our autonomy, our drones, our autonomous vehicles, as well robotics, and other future technology that we see commercializable between sort of 2023 and 2028 as part of this multi-year transformation program. So I've got quite a diverse portfolio, but it's a great job.
I definitely want to talk more about the robots, but before we get there, you mentioned megatrends. So can you share what some of the megatrends you see, especially as it relates to climate change and climate risk?
Yep, so just for context, for statistics, so UPS delivered 5.5 billion packages last year, roughly 20 million a day. That represents 3% of the global GDP was moved by us, 6% of the US GDP. We did that with 125,000 vehicles and 570 large-scale aircraft around the world. That is a very significant footprint. We take very seriously our obligation to lessen the weight of that footprint. But the problem is the mega trends are making the foot bigger. And this is one of the challenges, and the two that I'd call out. The first is just urbanization. Urban cities are inherently inefficient when it comes to last mile delivery in terms of the congestion and the pollution that comes from that. In the next 30 years, 2.5 billion more people will move into urban areas than today. So this is a significant issue as you think about the carbon footprint of the globe. And then the second is e-commerce. There isn't probably a person in this room who doesn't look forward to having that box sitting outside their door at one point. The reality is only 14%, and this is the United States, 14% of retail last year was by value done digitally, but it was 20% of volume. That's going to double in the next 10 years to more than 40% of volume. So if you think back to, say, a decade ago, the average shopping consumer was that the weekly shop was a person went to a store and bought 14 to 16 items on average and brought them home. That was one carbon trip. You now have, at some point, 40% of that being single eaches coming to their home. And so there's this significant expansion of behavior. And I think that there are many things that companies like ours can do to help consumers lessen the impact of that. And there's some things that I can talk about. But the reality is this drive for convenience, Grubhub and Uber Eats and all of the sorts of things that kind of give people a sense of convenience, there's not necessarily yet accountability for the carbon footprint that leaves.
So what are some of the investments that UPS is making to try to address and get ahead of some of these challenges?
So we invest very heavily in technology. So we have three major commitments. With 25% of all of our electricity will be renewable by the year 2025. 40% of all the fuel that we use will be non-carbon, so non-traditional gasoline or diesel. And that a quarter of all of the vehicles that we order each year will be electric. So two major investments that we've made in the last 12 months. So the first is, and this was a couple of weeks ago, we've invested in a British company called Arrival that has really done a nice job of creating commercial level of vehicles that are entirely electric. And so they duplicate the capacity or the cube volumetric scale that we need to be holding 250 to 300 packages on a daily route. And they've done such a good job with the battery that it actually fits our needs. So we've ordered 10,000 of those and expect to continue to build that up. The second is in the area of, we call it Orion, on-road integrated, I knew I'd forget the O and the N. Something network. It's basically Waze on steroids. So we drove 3 billion miles last year to deliver that 5.5 billion packages. And the most green mile is the mile you don't drive. If you think about the day of one of our drivers, it's incredibly dynamic. You're getting pickups, requests that come in during the day. You get changes in delivery, and so the route can change 14 to 17 times a day. It used to be done by the experience of the driver, which is why so many of our routes have had the same driver 15 and 20 years, which is why they're so popular and they're well known in the neighborhoods, et cetera, but they had to do it by memory. Through this dynamic routing, we saved roughly last year 100 million miles by our calculation, which is therefore equal to over 10 million gallons of fuel, which is equal to 100 million metric tons of carbon that was avoided. So those are just two investments that we make constantly to not only drive efficiency, because there's value in terms of our operations, but also to reduce the carbon footprint of the company.
It's easy for me to see the efficiency gains of the Orion project and minimizing the travel. Absolutely understood. Tell me about electrification. Is that seen as a cost saver at the end of the day, or how are you thinking about those investments?
So I think there's three levels. So the first level is just simply the electrification of the last mile in urban areas. So there are cities in the U.S., Hamburg, Paris, Munich, where what they're in essence doing is they're creating carbon-free zones or low-carbon zones, which means that they eliminate the ability to have traditional vehicles within several miles. Now, we still have to deliver packages. So what we've done is we've created a system by which we have containers on the edges, and then we in essence have electric bikes, electric trikes, that instead of holding 300, they maybe can hold 50, and then they go back and forth and do routing. And so we're able to compete in that. We'd love to do it everywhere, but you take your life in your hand in Manhattan to try and drive one of those things with vehicles. I mean, you've all seen those Uber drivers. It's pretty deadly. So, I mean, it needs to be in sort of this city orientation in terms of that electrification. The second is electrifying the vehicles themselves, and so Arrival. I'm pretty optimistic that we're starting to crack the economic with the commercialization at scale for a company like ours. It used to be that it was through good nature and your commitment that you would invest and pay a premium with a sort of a shaky NPV or a lower payback. With the technology and battery and some of the other progress that's been made, it's actually the payback is getting to a reasonable level where anything less than 4 years is a pretty good payback, and so it's the economics of the actual electrification. The third to me though is autonomy. So it is truly the ability to start to eliminate the normal hours of humans working and shifting more, and you're not needing humans to do work. So we fly feeder aircraft and the sorts of things that happen, and we try and do it in workable hours to get people who want to do those sorts of jobs. With the current FAA rules that are under consideration and release, up to 7,000 pounds. Well, we have about 270 feeder routes every single day that go less than 7,000 pounds that are going from a primary airport to a secondary airport. The ability to do that by autonomy. One, not only has an electrical reduction, but we're also able to potentially two-trip that and then do more volume somewhere else and taking it off of either the ground or ground or air, but also not having to have pilot hours and all the sorts of things that make that so constrained with humans. So autonomy to me is a third area where it's electrification plus the autonomous nature.
Tell me more, because I think my mental model when I think of drones these days are these little devices that maybe could carry a little package. I suspect this is something much more than that.
Yeah, so we're testing three things right now. So UPS Flight Forward, which is part of my team, is the first FAA certified drone airline. It's a Part 135 certificate. You can Google that. We were first. Don't listen to what Google says. That's ironic. You can Google wasn't first. And we're good friends with Google, by the way, just in case anyone's in the room. So that airline is actually for last mile delivery. And so back to how do we bend the curve on some of these mega trends. So working with CVS, we're now able to drone deliver from a CVS store pharmaceutical prescriptions basically to residential areas within a 10-mile radius. Now, this is all done on a sort of a 107 exemption with the FAA. So, I urge to say we're very early days in this process, and I think the FAA and the DOT naturally get a little angst-ridden when it appears that business is getting ahead of them. We're not. All this is in collaboration with the FAA. But what that means is that in the future, in particular suburban and rural, it's not going to work well in urban. You're just not going to be able to drone something to apartment 4A in downtown Manhattan. It's just not going to work. But in suburban and rural, people can geocode a location, and that in essence becomes their drone delivery address. And we'll be able to establish drone as a service for retail stores, restaurants, et cetera. And what's interesting is the cost curve is really, really important here, where, an actual human driving these things for last mile delivery is, say, $12 to $13. The curve on drones look like with 5G and the ability to reduce the amount of memory that needs to be in the actual hardware, we're going to get to a half of that. So this is getting very interesting very quickly. The other area is in campus environments. So in North Carolina, Wake Med Hospital, there's 7 buildings that collect specimens, samples, et cetera, and there's one central lab. They had a person who was just all day driving this. We've established a drone network to do that. So what took 20 minutes now takes 3 minutes, and it costs less. But what's also important out of this is that cancer diagnoses are coming back faster. So people, instead of having to wait for 2 hours. And then, what they see is a major opportunity for them is that in this community of, say, a 30 or 60 square mile area, they have multiple healthcare facilities. There are really some dangerous snakes in North Carolina with very expensive anti-venom. And because of a short shelf life, because of the cost, they keep one. Well, if you get bit and you show up the right one, you're golden. If you don't, then you got to wait 30, 40 minutes to get there. And we're able to set up a drone network to be able to ensure that you can get that sort of centralized location set up to, one, reduce the cost of operation, but also, of course, speed up the life-saving nature of the opportunity.
In all these cases, you're reducing the cost, which is wonderful. That would likely increase the consumption, right? So we'll see more use of drones, more package delivery, more. Can you speak a little bit to the powering of all of these electrified devices here? Is UPS getting involved, behind the meter or beyond the meter here in terms of where you're getting electricity from?
Yeah, so we are working carefully upstream. So not only with the hardware makers to ensure that we get a charging mechanism that's highly efficient as the base, but also how we're going to access the electrification for the charging. So back to our commitment to continue to bend the cost curve. Solar is a great opportunity for the drone world, not only in terms of drones themselves being able to capture, but also the ability to store. This is one of the challenges. Business on their own cannot do this. It requires this public-private partnership. And if I use California as an example, where you have a significant amount of natural gas that's been implemented, you have a lot of nuclear, obviously. But solar and wind is only about 3% of the usage in California, which is probably one of our most advanced states. In order to be able to significantly increase that, and then get, say, up to 30 or 40% solar, your storage needs to be 36.3 million megawatt hours of storage is required because it's intermittent, both wind and solar. Today they have 15,000. So they have to 24,000% increase. Businesses won't do that. There's not the shareholder return to not to on their own. So tax incentives and these sorts of things are a way to be able to, I think, motivate the business to then start to look at to how do we then think about these drone airlines having more solar on them. And it's more of an ecosystem iterative approach as opposed to right now, we're for the most part just sticking with traditional electricity when we think about drones.
In a number of your examples, you've been discussing the role of policy, be it local policy in the way they do traffic, be it federal aviation policy, and now, of course, even broader policies here. How does UPS think about itself and its involvement in those policy arenas and the policy process?
So we're naturally very active. So we actually have an office in D.C. It's a pretty substantial office. It's headed by a woman named Laura Lane, who leads all of our government relations. We do federal, and we're on the Hill a lot, but also at a state level. So if you were to think about autonomous vehicles, for example, so right now with Waymo, we are testing in Arizona autonomous pickups. So we have UPS stores where people come and drop off packages. And so what we have is a driver traditionally was having to divert their routes to go pick them up. What we now have is a Waymo vehicle that is self-enclosed. It has a safety driver today, but we'll be able to remove the safety driver soon, which in essence just autonomously does this loop, this feeder, the sweep loop, and it'll stop, and then the UPS store employee comes out, and they have a barcode written to open the door. They put in the parcel, it collects, and it goes into the to center. And so that had to be done in conjunction not only with the Department of Transportation, but then also Arizona as a state. And so you have to have the state policy connections as well. And some states are more advanced than others. So you have to, and it's not even just in the United States, globally. We have a global network. So wherever we have hubs, where we have large centers, wherever we have major facilities on airport, we have to have very good relationships with governments.
I want to observe that we're going to open up for Q&A here in a little while. So I want you to start to think, if you have any questions for Scott, please be ready to come up forward. But let's continue our conversation here. Let's talk a little bit about competition. We're both strategists here. You have partners like Google. You have partners like Amazon, who also perhaps, as you move into this autonomous and electrical world, could also be competitors here. How do you think about that mix of partnership and competition?
It's a nicer version of the question from our last earnings call. Amazon is an interesting situation for our company because they are, by our own 10K release yesterday, our largest customer at 11.2% of revenue. So we hit the threshold above 10%, the volume being more than that. But they're also creating their own network. But there is a general misunderstanding that Amazon is going to create capacity to take away our business today. So the statistics that are important for everyone to understand is last year, 54 million packages a day were delivered in the United States. That will grow to 122 million by the year 2020. So e-commerce has a problem with supply of logistics of last mile. So there are parts of the business where Amazon, where we're not interested, but there are parts where they're not interested in building networks. So it makes no sense to have two vehicles in Horses Whisper, Montana carrying two packages each. It makes no sense whatsoever. But when you get into dense areas like, metro areas of Atlanta, there's so much volume there that there's an ability to coexist. So we don't necessarily see Amazon as the threat that maybe our purple competitors have talked about. I think that's a bit of sour grapes. Whenever you're fired, you do get a little pissy, but I just think that overall, I'm more concerned around how our industry grows to be able to adjust to this huge volume increase than necessarily worrying that someone who is a customer today is going to be a competitor tomorrow.
Yeah. Once again, I'd like to welcome up anyone who has a question for Scott. Does anyone have one ready to go? Keep thinking about it. Keep working on that. We want to give you the opportunity.
Crowd.
Yeah, exactly. That's we'll start cold calling here in a second.
There we go.
A few of you, if you don't step up on this matter here.
We scared this one off.
Could maybe talk a little bit more about climate risk for you, and I'm thinking in particular maybe weather-related challenges that climate can pose. How does UPS think about those?
Yeah, it's a growing concern in as much that we are a large air network and we are a large ground network and we're safety first focused. So we absolutely will not compromise when it comes to the safety of our employees. So as you think about counting weather days that interrupt packages, we have seen increases. And so if you think about whether or not that really unique toothbrush you ordered gets there on time is less relevant than some of the critical healthcare medicines that we deliver around the world. So we have a very large healthcare life sciences practice. We deliver a lot of very specific customized medicine specimens, et cetera. And we have commitments on delivery time because of the fact that you have to have stability in terms of not only temperature, but other aspects. And it does cause issues. So the mitigation cost gets higher. So, I don't have a specific forecast that we're worried about in the next 5 to 10 years, but we are starting to see it in terms of the impact on our network.
Excellent. So we do have a question. Daniel, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, thanks, Scott, for sharing with us here. One of the mega trends you mentioned is e-commerce. Obviously, it's a big issue, and you talk about the carbon footprint associated with the fact that we have all this new volume coming through e-commerce. One thing that would be interesting to me, I don't know if you have the data on this, to think about whether it's a net benefit or a net harm in terms of taking people going to stores off the road, and whether you could manage a fleet doing e-commerce more efficiently from a carbon emissions standpoint.
Yep, so we have a lot of statistics, a lot of data, a lot of intelligence in this area. It is not net beneficial. So the issue is that in that 14 to 33% increase, the problem is you have millions of addresses in the United States. You have 7 days a week. The average residential delivery is 1.2 boxes. At most, that's going to 1.4. So you think, well, how can it double and move? It's because you're getting a deeper penetration of people ordering at addresses that currently aren't being delivered at today. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to create mechanisms by which you can create artificial density by the customer. So for all of you here to please go download UPS My Choice. That's our app. We have 60 million users in the United States. And through that app, we're trying to help create synthetic density by access points. So in many cases, we have this issue with porch pirates and things where people are not looking to have it just left on their front door or in urban areas in particular, in common areas. And so we have all of these access point partners at CVS, amongst others, where you can go on and you can divert your shipment. And what happens is that 1.2 becomes 4 roughly. So the behavior of the consumer can start to drive a higher level of density and therefore reduce the carbon, and it's something that we're starting to promote aggressively. The second is working upstream with digital players to try and create a day of week selection, which means that for the most part, people are not ordering because they need it tomorrow. They're ordering because they remembered they need it, period. And the vast majority of shipments, based on the research that we've done, 90%, aren't necessarily needed the next day. And if you kind of get into this habit that says, unless I push an exception budget button on my order, 90, all of those will come on Wednesday or Tuesday or Thursday, whatever day it is that you want. Again, the ability that at a single residential address, you're able to get to 4 to 5 density. Those are the mechanisms by which we actually can create the synthetic density that creates a better carbon footprint than everyone driving to the stores and getting it themselves.
Can UPS drive that, or is that driven more by your e-commerce partners that need to?
We have to go it upstream because we don't store. So we can't hold things for 6 days and then deliver it all together. Our network isn't designed for that. So it has to be upstream so that it's pended as an order and then it's executed to be able to insert the network at the right time.
Yeah, how do you convince your partners then to?
We're working through it. And look, I think overall, most large-scale companies either want to do good or feel obligated to do good. You can decide yourself in terms of where they are in that spectrum. But they see this as a mechanism by which they can put their hand up and say, we're doing something. It's a slight shift in terms of how they operate. The critical issue is how you communicate it and then how you educate consumers when it's at a scale of availability.
Yeah. Another question here?
Hi, I'm Liz from NYU Stern. Thank you for being here today. I was wondering when you were talking about the autonomous vehicles, how you handle the messaging internally about that as a change management issue when you have so many drivers working for you.
You work for the Teamsters? No, we are the largest Teamster employer in the United States, and we take that relationship very seriously. It's an 80-year relationship. Our founder, Jim Casey, established that relationship early on. We have done study after study after study, and our drivers are an incredible asset and ambassador to the business. 9 times out of the 10, you read about a UPS driver. They've saved somebody from a burning building, and they've gone out of the way. There was one going around Christmas where they hid a kid's bicycle behind the garbage can because they knew the family and they knew the kid was going to get off the bus and come home and might see the Christmas present early. And so that got a lot of observation. So we're not wanting to disrupt our current employee base. But back to that 54 million going to 122 million, we can't continue in today's model forever. And therefore, there's a role for autonomy. Now, the autonomy is more going to be the movement as opposed to the delivery. So we've invested in a company called Too Simple. We've also are working with another company where in essence we have feeder routes. So I told you about the air routes that are done with up to 7,000 pounds. There's ground versions of that. So we're actually today moving autonomously with a safety driver now on 200 and 300 mile routes, trailers, and it's quite effective. We're also using something a company called Peloton, where with that group, if you have multiple trucks, the first driver controls 3 vehicles, and the other 2 are remotely following it. And I've gone on a test with sat in the second vehicle. No one's touching the wheel. You're going 65 miles an hour down a highway, and you're 30 feet away in front of the vehicle in front of you. And then, oh, by the way, there are still stupid people who try and drive in between you. I mean, it boggles the mind. But keen that the software is good enough to be able to accommodate that. So all of those are actually helping us to grow at scale. The reality is the U.S. has a driver shortage problem. It is a serious issue. There's CDL, C driver's license shortages. You hear about it all the time. So you hear a lot about how technology is going to disrupt and make so many people unemployed. You're not going to eliminate drivers in urban areas. You're not going to get, robots delivering to the door. It just isn't going to work. So I still think there's a lot of growth that we can build off of autonomy while still maintaining the current employee base.
And because you mentioned the Teamsters, we've talked about policy. What about like NGOs or even activists and the like? How do you think about your interface with them and what role they might play in your efforts?
So we work with a lot of NGOs just in terms of doing good. So when it came to, for example, the drone example in Africa, we're working with a company called Zipline to move critical medicines and blood, actually. So one of the biggest killers, and it's Ghana is the example that we use, of mothers after birth is blood loss. And they're very far away, and we're using drones as a life-saving effort to be able to get the necessary blood there within 15 to 20 minutes when it used to take several hours and potentially loss of life. So we work with NGOs there. Look, I think this whole topic of sustainability is becoming real. I mean, our second largest shareholder is BlackRock, and Larry Fink sent a letter around to major corporations in which they own shares, and we were one of them, talking about expectations that as they think about how they invest their money, they would like this topic taken seriously. And our chairman and I, when we were in World Economic Forum in Davos a couple of weeks ago, had a chance to meet with the BlackRock people. So there's this ecosystem of recognition and ideation coming. I don't think it particularly helpful to try and target any one company as saying that they are, the worst of something in this whole area. I think a more collaborative and positive approach is going to work a lot better in the long run.
Excellent. We have a couple more questions here, so please.
Awesome. So one of the questions you all addressed early on was around mega trends and macro trends. How do you think about, both at UPS but also with your partners, around bending to the trend versus bending the trend? Because in some situations, some of these trends we're seeing, especially in consumer behaviors, just truly are pretty scary in the landscape of climate change. And so how do you balance both the bending the trend itself and bending to the trend?
Yeah, it's a very important point. And so, we kind of think about it in the next 5 years and then the period after that, roughly 5 to 8 years. By my rough math, if we can get the autonomy and some of these trends of electrification, et cetera, done, you might be able to still find a path to this 2050 outcome. I think what's so challenging right now, and I mean, it's a part of my job, it's a part of your job, the pace of change by technology is so fast. I mean, making a projection to 2040, it's a little silly, quite honestly. My view is that human ingenuity is going to outpace human consumption, I hope, in this area when it comes to carbon in the United States. But I spent most of my working career, 25 years, outside the United States. And I managed most of Asia, Europe at different times of my career. And developing markets are not interested in someone telling them they can't be middle class like all those people they see on TV. And that's really kind of the pent-up challenge that we have, is that I see a path with these large, mature economies being able to neutralize, but can they offset the desire of these other countries who want to live a better life? I don't think so. I think, to me, that's the biggest challenge that we have, is the mix of that globally.
I would just say I would agree. I think when looking at, again, at like agriculture, the obvious solution is changes of consumption habits away from protein, meat-based diets. Easily said. How do you actually motivate a global citizenry to have changes in their preferences and consution?
I'm still waiting for the impossible steak.
Yeah.
The burger I'm good with.
The burger you're okay with? Okay.
Impossible steak, I'm still waiting.
There you go. I believe this was the next question over here.
Thank you guys so much. Edward Hill, originally from Virginia, but coming today from NYU Stern. Thank you guys both so much for starting off the conversation today, the conference, with a great conversation about this topic. I'm really curious, and also just admire the work that you've done with Arrival, purchasing a 10,000 vehicle fleet. Talking about the energy sources is certainly one part of the challenge, making sure that you're able to access renewables, but also thinking about that fleet in the terms of being a flexible storage unit. I'm curious if you've looked into demand response opportunities at all across that 10,000 vehicle fleet, and whether or not you might be able to enable more renewables coming online on the grid.
Yeah, it's a great point. And look, we're grappling with two things. The first is we've made this order ahead of a clear line of sight to the grid that's going to help support it. And so we're working, for example, with the City of London to be able to understand when the grid is going to be there that's going to allow us. Because, look, these will disproportionately draw power relative to carbon fuels. And back to the whole public-private partnership, a lot of work needs to be done to create the reliable access to what should hopefully be sustainable electricity, sustainably sourced electricity for companies in scale to make this journey. How we're able to use the vehicles, there's a number of things that we're looking at, quite honestly, to be able to answer your question, but some of them are still a little bit confidential, so I won't be able to go much farther on it, other than to say, yeah, absolutely, it's something that we're looking at.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Shrinka from Georgia Tech. So I had some questions about you guys moving towards autonomous vehicles and unmanned vehicles. So how do you guys mitigate the issues of risk and security around these packages that are being delivered through unmanned vehicles or drones?
Yeah, so go Georgia Tech Bulldogs, yay. So back to where in the network, and so in terms of how the package gets delivered, we're a ways from a autonomous delivery. Now there's something that we're looking at, and there are now bipodal, in essence, humanoid robots that can grip that we could use. But we do not get a really good reaction. I mean, honest to God, the Terminator, ooh, kind of stuff. People don't want that walking up to their front door. It feels intimidating. So, this is why the Japanese have done so well making them look cute. But the navigational use cases are so complex in last mile delivery on an average route that we're really more looking at route assist, which means that 12% of a driver's time is based on search and find. So he's got 300, he or she has 300 packages in the back of the vehicle. At the beginning of the day, when they stop at address number 1, they got to find the first 2, 3 parcels, and that takes time. Is using robotics in the back of the vehicle to be able to do that and hand them over. So right now, the autonomy that we're using, for the most part, is feeders, which is a human on one end is loading it. They take it when it arrives, and then they unload it. It's not actually being yet used as last mile. There have been some cute, like little puppy dog kind of, things that have been used in like New York, which annoyed the mayor no end when he found out somebody had done it without authorization, et cetera. It's just going to add congestion, is my view at this point in the urban area. So we really haven't yet got to an autonomous last mile, other than drones and air for suburban and rural. I think rooftops is going to end up being part of the answer for urban areas. Which will require quite a bit of infrastructural change, because the vast majority of rooftops are not necessarily designed for residential use.
Let's talk a little bit about internal management. UPS is very well known for being excellent at execution and executing their strategies. Maybe reflect on your role and how you bring about change in the organization, especially sitting at the a C-suite level here, and obviously needing to implement throughout the organization.
Yep, so we've rallied around 3 buckets. So the first bucket is cost, and we are an engineering company. Every process you can well imagine is engineered, even the famous no left turns in urban cities. For all the reasons that we have calculated it, we know exactly the most efficient way to do it. But our cost can be disrupted by lower cost models, and that has been part of this overall mega trend search, was also what are the cost models that could disrupt us. So we have to bend our cost curve, and we're in the process of doing that, and that's both our operations, it's our back office, et cetera. So how we reduce our cost to operate and measured on a per package is a pretty significant part of what my transformation team does. The second is just how we grow, and so how do we leverage technology to grow? How do we use digital platforms? How do we give our end customers the tools for them to help us become more efficient, because it reduces the unsuccessful first delivery and the sorts of things that, one, add cost, but also make it a less successful delivery in the eyes of the consumer. The third bucket is probably the one that's the most challenging, which is what I call talent and culture. So I'll just take them separately. The talent profile that's required for the future is changing so quickly that it's very hard to grow internally 100% of the skills that you need in order to compete and to succeed these days. And so that was a pretty big shock for a company like UPS that has been for 112 years a promote from within culture. You can't pull too hard, which is suddenly everyone is hired from the outside, because then what you end up doing is you disenfranchise people who've been there 20 years, have got another 15 years left in their career, feeling like they can't progress forward. So putting in place talent development programs, leveraging technology, but in a really disciplined way, so that you're clear that as you understand, for example, data analytics, artificial intelligence, advanced technology, you're not going to grow those skills internally, bringing those externally, but then bringing in insiders to learn as you're going through the process. The culture is interesting, and every company that I know has cultural challenges right now. So, it's values are the bedrock of every culture, and the values of UPS were very attractive to me. It's around integrity and striving for excellence. I'm focused upon serving our customers. But what ends up happening is that the behaviors that are the most competitive around those values, they get dated. And so we've had to go back through this process to say, well, what does striving for excellence actually mean in terms of your behavior? Customer first, what does that actually mean? And so we're changing the culture by changing an understanding of what the successful behaviors around those values are, ultimately for the purpose of changing the culture of the company.
Do you have specific metrics, incentives, values around climate change and sustainability? Is that baked into this transformation process?
Every senior manager's performance appraisal includes their role in achieving these objectives that I laid out for 2025 and as well for 2030 on these sustainability goals. So even the procurement heads, right? Ooh, I found a cheaper vehicle. Yeah, but that's not an EV vehicle, right? So we ensure that everyone is, the whole cross-functional ecosystem is aligned to achieving those goals, and everyone's rated on it.
Yeah. Well, we have a few more minutes here. Again, if you have any more questions, please come forward. But I also would like to hear from you, what advice could you give our MBA students out here in the audience here? You've had a very interesting career trajectory. You've been with multiple organizations. Now you found yourself at UPS. We have students here interested in climate change, interested in that interface between business and sustainability. What advice would you give?
Yeah, so I think first off is no matter what industry you go into, no matter what your job is going to be, this is going to touch you, this issue of sustainability. It's touching everyone. So even, people who went and worked in investment banking used to be somewhat displaced from it, no longer. Now how your capital is used and whether that furthers the sustainability agenda is now seen. So everyone will be affected by this. The second is all the solutions are technology-based. And versus maybe when I was a student a long time ago, the gap between individuals who are accountable for paying for implementing technology and the ones who understand technology is just huge. And I find this issue, and Mike and I were talking about it earlier back, I have sort of a test, and this is a universal test. I don't care if you're 30, 40, or 50. If you can't tell me succinctly what the cloud is, how blockchain works, and what does 5G mean, then you are not educating yourself on what technology is doing and what those will mean in 5 and 10 years' time. So you have to own your own technology orientation. You don't have to be an engineer, but if you don't understand these concepts, how at a point in your career when you're approving business cases, how are you going to be a critical thinker in this area if you don't understand the technologies? And then the third is live your aspiration, right? So count how many boxes you've got outside your front door, and count how many times you've had Grubhub deliver in the rain. I mean, everyone's got a carbon footprint, right? So, we find sometimes people will say, oh, UPS, you have to do more. Well, in some ways, on a per package basis, we are doing more. But blaming us is like blaming the thermometer for the temperature. We are fulfilling the demand. We've got to work collectively to try and reduce the demand. I urge everyone to take responsibility in that.
So, as a last question, You've already hinted that you're not great into thinking about predictions because they're going to be wrong, but I'm going to ask you anyway. I was just saying, I'm actually working on a new book looking at 2050, trying to see our potential for decarbonization. I am betting on the fact that by the time I get to 2050, I'll be old enough that no one will remember that I wrote a book about this in 2020.
Nothing disappears from the internet.
Right, that's true. It'll always be out there. But let's not look 2050. Let's look more like 2030. Any thoughts, forecasts, like where are we going to be by then? How is the world going to look? How advanced are we going to be in some of these technologies? And maybe thinking with the opportunity lens, what's going to be the new opportunity maybe around that time period?
Yep, so I would separate it between the private citizen, the role of corporations, and then the role of government. When it comes to the role of the private citizen, I think that there's this groundswell of orientation. I think it's starting with younger people, and I think younger people are affecting older people, and I think more and more people are taking this seriously, which is a very good thing. So my wife had a chance to go and listen to a speech by Greta. We're recycling everything now in my house, including the dog diapers. We have a really old dog. And so that, I think, is a very positive. I think corporations are collectively now taking responsibility and ensuring that part of it, just simply to attract talent, are talking more around the responsibility, the metrics, and the aspirations that the corporations have in terms of helping this process to achieve a carbon neutral existence. It's the government piece that to me is still globally a little bit ineffective. So yes, we had the Paris Accord. There are still too many doubters out there that undermine a little bit, and the undermining is seen then in how the government's role through tax and through policy motivate and synergize and maybe expand the value of those two first buckets. Corporations have shareholders. They have to be able to show a return to attract more capital and more investment. Tax and policy is one way to help do that. And so I think all three legs of that stool need work. The government leg of it, to me, globally, is probably the one that's the most inconsistent and unstable.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on here. I love the systems perspective, as I call it here, and that it really does take involvement of everyone here to help move the system forward and try to address this change. Please join me in thanking Scott for giving us time here.